Everybody has potential, but very few people get to live up to theirs. Most people find themselves held back by constraints. Social, physical, mental, or emotional barriers hold us back from doing what we wish we could, from being connected to communities and part of something greater. The Gamers Against Weed group of interest could fill their own video, and at this point, if no one bigger is going to do that, I might have to do it myself. All you need to know for this skip is that they're a group of millennial and zoomer anartists. Many of them are queer, and all of them are leftist. They surround themselves in jokes and silly anomalies, but the group has a deep heart. Despite being a mainlist article, SCP-4239 is really more of a tale about the ways that the group manages to do more than they ever expected to in order to help people overcome those barriers that hold them back from being great and in inspiring greatness in others. Instead of a standard SCP article, 4239 is presented as a volunteer project information document managed by Bones, the extraterrestrial planet killer satellite that monitors the Gamers Against Weed chat rooms. The first two sections of the document are the SCP Foundation and Global Occult Coalition's information on the Kenowhere project, stolen by the gamers and intended to stress the seriousness of secrecy and OPSEC. Throughout the pages of the Kenowhere Project Volunteer Hub, GAW members make comments using the footnotes. In true Gamers Against Weed fashion, nearly all of these add nothing to the information other than color commentary, which helps to give the document a living feel and shows off the characters. The first section, SCP P Heart 9, is heavily corrupted with very little comprehensible information, and is presented as nothing but gibberish. Bones, ever considerate as it always is, even begins by noting that people using screen readers should skip the section. All that can be made out are a few notes. Foundation personnel are working in cooperation with the local government, and the Global Occult Coalition is involved somehow. GAW leader Bluntfiend calls them both janitors, noting that the GOC are the mean ones. Gay Cop MP4, on the other hand, calls them tank fuckers. Other than that, we're told the anomaly's size and shape are inconsistent, to which Polarized Crafts notes he's trying his best. The Foundation believes 4239 will expand to reach Kenosha, Wisconsin by 2033, though Polarized Crafts calls this bullshit. Next is a GOC Threat Entity Database entry, stolen by Green Man Walking, who notes that the document may have changed since they stopped letting him look at it on November 9, 2017. While the Foundation focused on the bubble of reality that hides the camp, the GOC identifies the primary anomaly as Known Threat Entity 6561 Black, or Fenrir Unbound, and gives it an authorized response level of 3, or Moderate Threat. KTE 6561 Black is a 2.1 meter tall humanoid entity with a dog's head. They don't know how old it is, but archaeological evidence suggests that the entity is several thousand years old, possibly as old as recorded history. According to the GOC, KTE 6561 Black is able to control a parallax-type anomaly, designated KTE 6561 Blackchild. The secondary anomaly is essentially a bubble of reality obscured from any sort of conventional or unconventional imaging, and Black is able to prevent any unwanted people from entering the bubble. There isn't any information they have on the psychological profile of KTE 6561 Black, though many people have gone missing, drawn to KTE 6561 Parallax Blackchild for some unknown purpose. The GOC suspects that these people are religious followers of the entity, theorizing that it might be a pistisphage, that is to say, that it eats or draws strength from faith and worship, or that it might simply want to be worshipped without needing supernatural benefits from the act. They likely got that idea because the majority of people who are drawn to the entity seem to be slightly more likely to be religious than the general population. The other thing that most of them have in common is that they're alienated. A quarter of them have criminal records ranging from illegal gathering, that is to say, likely protesting, assaulting an officer, or desertion. The entity itself expresses a hatred for the United States. About half of the people drawn to the island are unemployed, suggesting difficulty or unwillingness to integrate into society. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why the skip resonates so much with me. Because KTE 6561 Black never leaves KTE 6561 Parallax Blackchild, and because any outsiders are turned away from the invisible, unreachable island, The GOC's primary goal is to get the entity away from the island somehow. As of the document being stolen, they don't seem to have any idea of how to do that and simply watch the area where KTE 6561 Parallax Blackchild is, hoping to figure something out eventually. We're then given the entity's history. It's incredibly old, first showing up in Anatolia, Turkey at the site of Göbekli Tepe, one of the first instances of a human gathering place, believed to be a temple of some kind. Göbekli Tepe is positively ancient, from well before humanity developed agriculture and settled down and everything went aside. It was a social site built by hunter-gatherers for cultural or spiritual reasons. At the site, etheric resonance imaging technology used on one of the terrazzo floors of the third layer revealed something written in English well before any alphabet was ever created, but the GOC has redacted the information to anyone without a level Q clearance. Greenman Walking notes that he didn't have that clearance at the time, but the GAW members reading the document can probably guess what this said. We'll have to wait until the next document to find out for ourselves, though. The next instance of the entity in history is an Akkadian cuneiform tablet from Golestan province in Iran. The tablet was recovered by the Office for the Reclamation of Islamic Artifacts, who provided the GOC a copy. It tells of a dog-headed warrior who came from the Caspian Sea area to fight a Sarkic cult. The warrior was brutal and was said to have scourged the land so that no living thing could grow. The Gamers Against Weed don't have a copy of the tablet, but a footnote suggests that getting one should be a priority the next time a member of the GOC or Oriya decides to defect. The dog-headed warrior shows up throughout history for thousands of years, and its presence tends to correlate with the collapse of governments, so it's no wonder the GOC is a little concerned. They've even had a few encounters with it themselves, starting in 1997, when campers in Arizona reported seeing a man with the head of a coyote. The GOC managed to get footage and confirm the existence of the entity, but after distracting them with a malfunctioning vehicle, it managed to destroy all recordings of its existence. While the GOC assessment team waited to get a new ride home, they heard KTE 6561 Black laughing really fucking hard somewhere out of sight for like half an hour. Over 2 decades, the GOC had several run-ins with KTE 6561 Black before it started living in a shrouded island in the middle of Lake Michigan. Most recently was in 2016, when the entity stole a speedboat from Kenosha, Wisconsin, though lesbian Gengar dismisses the accusation of theft, saying, "It doesn't count if he gave it back, dude." Clearly, the GOC disagreed. Not that they had much concern for the speedboat, and had been getting together anti-watercraft artillery before it and the entity disappeared into thin air, tipping the GOC off that there was another anomaly. Since then, they've been staking out the area, occasionally getting handwritten notes from KTE 6561 Black asking them to end the occupation of their area. Those requests were denied. Finally, on October 18th, the GOC were given a note politely requesting that Requisitions Officer Sergeant Sylvanus Ayers come to the encampment for 1 month. He won't be allowed to bring any weapons or surveillance equipment, but he can take whatever notes he likes while he's there. Since they don't have any other information, the GOC agreed. Sylvanus Silas Ayers, whose given name results in incredulity from polarized crabs, is clearly Greenman Walking, who we already know from the footnotes has defected from the GOC to the GAW. The next document we get is a collection of excerpts from his journals as he makes his way into Kenowhere and why he eventually joins the Gamers Against Weed. He was transported to 6561 by speedboat, and when they crossed the dividing line, the speedboat's pilot disappeared, leading to a crash. When Silas got to the island, before they let him enter camp, they cleaned him up, dressing his wounds and giving him clean clothes to wear. And he notes that not only did they have clothes in his size, they had clothes that are in his style as well. They clearly knew enough about him that it was a bit worrying, but they also seemed like they were trying to make a good impression. They even held a feast in his honor. It's then that Silas realizes that 2 meters is really fucking tall, and apparently KTE 6561 Black can't fit shirts over his dog head, or at least he never seems to wear one. But he greets Silas in a dramatic and welcoming fashion that seems to inspire the GOC officer to reply in kind. For the rest of the feast, 6561 Black talked and boasted about fighting Sarkic cults and doing heroic things throughout history, assuring Silas that he'd have answers about his origins eventually. He also mysteriously said that he was fond of Jock Jam's Volume 6. At the time, Silas had no idea what that meant. Jock Jams, as far as he knew, was a series of workout albums by Tommy Boy Records. There wasn't a Volume 6, though there was an All-Star Jock Jams, and nothing about the track listing stood out as some kind of secret code. Of course, Jock Jams Vol 6 is the IRC handle of Gamers Against Weed member JJ, who can't believe Green Man Walking let Bones keep in the record what was obviously a joke. Over the next few days, Silas gets to know the people at the camp. Most of them had nowhere to go due to arrest warrants, gang membership, domestic abuse, political activism that drew the wrong attention, and other such things that put them on the outs of society. They claimed that the entity had called them to the island, and that when they didn't know where they could go, they could see him or hear him or smell him, and simply followed that. One person came to the island before there were showers, and helped cobble together plumbing out of the pipes. Another thought the dog man was the light of God Himself, and thought he was going to teach about justice and charity and Jesus. The entity didn't, though, but that person found a Bible no one was using, and after reading it cover to cover, they started giving sermons themselves. A former line cook came to the island and started feeding people and teaching others how to cook. A pickpocket came to the island and didn't know what to do until a week into their time on the camp when someone asked for volunteers to dig ditches to make sure that nothing flooded. Digging gives him time to think about something other than the rich getting richer. That's the general tone of the stories Silas hears. The people can't afford to be selfish and they all seem to work to help each other out. He goes to 6561 Black's tent to talk to him. Once again, the dog man is wearing nothing but a pair of cargo shorts, though this time his head is a fox. He calls him Sylvanus again, and Silas notes that most people don't call him that. But when the fox man asks if he'd like it if he called him Silas too, Silas doesn't have an answer. Changing the topic, Silas asks what he does on the island, aside from wander and gossip. It says that when it goes around talking to people, it's doing the same thing Silas is, but for different reasons. Silas says that what he's doing is researching an unknown threat to his organization and how to contain it. In a way, that really is what the entity is doing as well. But it just responds that Silas's answer is succinct and gives him the kind of look Silas describes as when you see a picture of a fox and you know it's just a fox, but you swear it knows something that you don't. The two go around the camp, Silas trailing along as the entity goes around listening to people's problems. It doesn't really do much. It listens and it assures people that they can do it. And they all act like he's right. Even people whose problems were logistical and relied on things that the island just didn't have believed the entity when it said they'd be able to do it. The entity asks Silas afterwards if he understands what it does now, to which Silas simply responds, no. A few days later, Silas asks people what they want to do when or if they ever get off the island again. One wants to be certified as a substitute teacher. Another wants to work in a food kitchen to pass on the good. Another wants to punch a Nazi as soon as they can leave, to which another person agrees, though long-term they'd like to be a medic during protests. Still another member wants to become an electrician, and according to a certified electrician on the island, they've already learned enough to accomplish it. And of course, one person says that Silas is basically a cop, so they aren't going to tell him anything. Good kid, that one. Everybody at the camp has some kind of radical bent, wanting to help the world if they can. Many of them hate the American government and capitalism and the military-industrial complex that funds the two. But none of them are being mind-controlled into building up the camp, and there's no army being formed, just people working together for a common good. No one tells anyone what to do, they just all have their own plans and goals and help each other when necessary. The whole thing seems to baffle Silas, who at this point can't really seem to comprehend the idea of anarcho-communism. 6 days into his stay, Silas gets fed up and asks the dog man if there's anyone else he can talk to get some answers. He's brought to a tent with a laptop, and the laptop has a chat open. The chat is with some of the members of the Gamers Against Weed. It's also here that Silas changes the entity's incredibly long chat handle, the throne of the third heaven of the nation's millennial General Assembly, to Green Man Walking. Lesbian Gengar starts out the conversation by asking Green Man Walking why he was even invited to the island. But that had been the question Silas himself wanted to ask. The Peanut Gallery chimes in, saying that they buy that answer, with Headcop OGG and Polarized Craps saying, he's kind of like a dog. He does things arbitrarily. But, like more. The entity essentially invited a spy in on purpose, which, according to Harmpit, checks out. The general tone of the conversation is that neither the members of the GAW or Silas really know why he's on the island, though he does tell the Gamers Against Weed that he's not going to give the GOC's report on the KTE. That line has 3 footnotes in the document from Lesbian Gengar, Green Man Walking himself, and Tolman Corvette. Each one of them consists solely of LMAO. The only meaningful information Silas gets from the conversation is that the entity is family, though they don't think he's anyone's dad or anything. He could be, though, since he's been around for a long time and you can never tell. At the end of the conversation, Lesbian Gengar tells Green Man Walking to try asking him what it gets by having them around and why they're working together. Then the computer shuts off, though Silas assumes this was purely for dramatic effect, since he was later given a transcript of the conversation for his journal. When he leaves the tent, the dogman tells him that they liked him. Fed up, Silas asks 6561 Black why he's working with the Reefers, which is the GOC codename for the Gamers Against Weed. The footnote says that, in his defense, it doesn't sound as ridiculous when everyone is using paramilitary nicknames. The two have a conversation about needs, finding shelter or drinking water so that you don't die. For the entity, the Reefers provide the same kind of protection and refreshment, especially from people like the GFC and the Foundation. Silas wonders why he doesn't go to the Serpent's Hand or something instead, but the entity says that the Serpent's Hand care about preserving magic in the same way that the GFC wants to destroy it. The entity has ancient enemies, but the Serpent's Hand doesn't make distinctions between it and them in the same way the GFC doesn't. One would protect it all while the other would destroy it all. Not entirely a fair assessment of either group, but not entirely wrong either. It's not the answer Silas expected, but he still doesn't understand why the Reefers were the group he stuck with and asks again. The entity, of course, is deliberately obtuse and says, why indeed? On day 8, Silas goes around asking other people on the island what the entity does, though he doesn't get any answers that satisfy him. Mostly it's just that he's like a village elder, or does dog stuff, and that he just chills and then you chill with him and you're chill together. Nothing on the island even seems occult, other than the fact that keeps it hidden and the dog man. Everyone is a normal person, but the people on the island get to work on the things that inspire them, the things they're really talented at. Half of them are working on hopeless projects without even having the tools they need or knowing what they're missing. Silas does know what they're missing, but keeps quiet because helping them would be treason, a statement that has Lesbian Gengar leaving a footnote of LOL. The entity isn't building an army here. In fact, the few times it gives out anything like an order, it's to stop a fight. Everyone is just acting on their own, working together. Nobody does anything they don't want to, but everybody is still helping each other out and the islanders are happy. Silas still can't seem to understand anarcho-communism, but he's starting to think about it. That night, he remembers being a kid and wanting things, wanting to help people. He loved cooking for other people and watching things grow. He used to be a lot like the people at the camp, wanting to be part of something and help the people around him. He used to like the carvings and statues at the cathedral where he lived, all the gargoyles and green men and saints. He wanted to know what it would be like to meet them. In the SCP setting, the GOC serves as a foil to the Foundation, where the Foundation wants to preserve normalcy by locking the anomalous up and studying it. The Global Occult Coalition is often more militant, opting instead to destroy anomalies that so much as might pose a threat. So it's a far cry from hanging out with pagan nature spirits. Silas isn't sure he likes working in an armory. On day 9, he goes right to the entity before the sun even comes up. This time, its head is like a jackal, and Silas feels that if it had a scale, it would measure his heart. Silas demanded to know why it was working with the Reefers. When asked what he'll do if he finds the answers he's looking for, Silas responds intuitively that he'll keep moving forward, so the entity finally shows him the answer, or at least part of it. He reaches beneath one of his bracers and gives Silas a card. Holy heck! You've just found yourself your very own Mr. Destiny by Gamers Against Weed. You are about to be asked a very important question. Who are you? Collect them all and become Mr. Gamer. The Little Misters are a series of SCPs from earlier years of the site, a series of anomalies that were mostly, but not always, human beings with strange abilities and a tattoo and a collector's card identifying them toys in the Little Misters line by Dr. Wondertainment. Dr. Wondertainment is sort of like Willy Wonka, but for toys, many of which are dangerous. The Gamers Against Weed mocked the idea of the capitalist toy maker and made their own Misters Against Weed line, making anomalous bodies and giving them to souls to cause a little merriment. The revelation that KTE 6561 Black is somehow one of the Reefer's little jokes is too much for Silas, who has a bit of a freakout. He loses his composure and asks when Mr. Destiny is going to do a trick with a computer or dazzle him with a live journal story. When he finally looks up to Destiny again, his head isn't a jackal or a coyote or a wolf. It's his neighbor's terrier from when he was a kid. Silas had an argument with his parents, and a neighbor let him spend the night, and when he did, the terrier came and comforted him, and in that moment he hoped that she'd live forever. But a week later, while learning to drive with his dad, he hit the dog, and it died in his arms. His dad told everyone that he'd been the one driving. Both times, it gave him the same compassionate doggy look of concern. He felt how young he was and how many more years she could have lived. And Mr. Destiny gave him a look that conveyed just how old he was and how alive he was. Destiny then told Silas two very important things. That he is the thing that lives in your heart and pushes you forward when you have something you don't know how to do. And two, that a live journal has been out of common use for some time now. That caused Silas to break up into a fit of laughter, which caused Mr. Destiny to laugh, which just made the laughing worse. When he finally got himself together, Silas left, despite still having so many questions. He went to sleep frustrated with himself and unsure of who he was, thinking about how he shouldn't be laughing with KTEs. The next day, there was a laptop waiting outside his tent. On it was another chat, this time just with Hetcop OGG. The others didn't want her to talk to Silas, but she felt like she should. Head Cop OGG is Dahlia Price, a trans college student and one of the few non-anomalous members of the Gamers Against Weed, but also one of the regular members. She tells Silas about how they were trying to do a summoning, and she thought that Mr. Destiny would just appear, but instead he walked through her dorm door, canine head and all. For complicated magic babble reasons, she was the one who had to drive him from Ohio to Wisconsin, where they'd be able to set up a little bit of folded space, so she's the one who has spent the most time with him. On the trip, she talked with Destiny. He told her how he slew a flesh demon. She told him how she wished she talked to her mom more. She told him about things like creating Mrs. Mad About Video Games, another of the Misters Against Weed that Dahlia and her girlfriend created, that sees her as a mother, despite being only a few years younger, and how she isn't really ready to be a mother, even of a regular baby. And he told her that when he slew the flesh demon, there were people that worshipped it and had nowhere to go after it was defeated. Even though they would have died if they had been allowed to live, a lot of them were angry at Mr. Destiny. Some of them wanted to make him their new god. He didn't tell them he was a god or a hero or anything, though, and he just stayed with them until they came up with a new faith that wasn't worshipping some sarkic monster. You don't really get to control what other people think of you, or what that makes you become. You can really only go from there. She talked to him about how she was thinking of changing majors because she didn't know what to do in life, and doesn't really feel like a grown-up. And he told her about how he used to spend all day chasing the sun across the sky so that the day would change, until one day he stopped doing that, and the sun found a different way to move across the sky. As long as you're doing the right thing you can, you just have to have faith that others will as well. After telling him all of this, Dahlia tells Silas that she believes Mr. Destiny, and that Silas should also believe him. He decides to take that under advisement. In his next entry, Silas is waffling about going to see Mr. Destiny, and spent most of the day after his conversation with Head Cop OGG sulking in the forest. He says he's put it off for too long and complains that he's not 16 anymore, and, according to the KTE, LiveJournal is dead and can't hurt him, though he scratches that part out of his journal. It's not very professional for a report. Maybe he'll do it the right way when he gets back. Once again, he presses Mr. Destiny on why he doesn't join up with the Serpent's Hand or even Anderson Robotics or something. And the entity explains to him that while the Serpent's Hand might be able to make a little spatial bubble, or even let him live in the Wanderer's library, he's been there before, and if he was with the Serpent's Hand, they would send him readers, acolytes and reality vendors, and people who would want to learn and worship him. And if that happened, he would simply drop over dead as surely as if Silas was suffocated. Mr. Destiny doesn't want to live as a god, he wants to make the world a better place. And despite the Gamers Against Weed's silly name, they help him with that. They send Mr. Destiny refugees and convicts and political dissidents and religious pilgrims. The people who come to the island aren't worshippers. They come to change who they are and the world they live in, or simply to be safe. History is driven by people like that. Young people will teach the old or bury them. And besides, Destiny says, the Gamers Against Weed are his family, and he's waited a very long time to be with his family. Once again overwhelmed by the answer, Silas is unable to come up with a response or follow-up question, and just walks away. The next day is Halloween of 2017. Silas spends the day grilling everyone he can, trying to understand them, trying to find holes in their stories, or to prove to himself that they're not really happy, or that there's some kind of conspiracy at work. The whole time, he avoids KTE's 6561 Black. But he doesn't notice any holes. What he does notice is that the island's resources are stretched thin. They couldn't really even have a Halloween because there wasn't enough food to go around. He notices most of the tents weren't prepared for the winter, that the diesel generators were running low. He notices the communal supply doesn't have enough coats and blankets to go around. And most of all, he notices that all of this bothers him. Many of the people he interviews told him that without Camp Kenowhere, they'd be dead, that it was the thing they worked towards and the safe place they can be. Without it, they'd be dead. On November 1st, Silas makes up his mind and walks into Mr. Destiny's tent, finally knowing what he's going to say. Silas says that he doesn't need Destiny, that he has a life and a job and a family, and he wasn't going to lose any of those before coming to Kenowhere. But Destiny needs Silas. We then move on to the fifth document. This time, it's the Gamers Against Weed official summation of events. Harm Pit, Jock Jams Volume 6, Polar Ice Crafts, Fallout Meta TXT, and Het Cop OGG created Mr. Destiny on January 11th, but somehow he was retroactively brought into existence 13,000 years ago. It has the ability to push people towards paths in life that they have a high aptitude for. It can't make anyone do anything, but it does help remove those barriers I mentioned way back at the beginning. Destiny, true to his name, wants to see everybody live up to their potential. The idea for Mr. Destiny came because JJ was sick of how many people joined the Gamers Against Weed group because they were unhappy. Many of them had superpowers, but were still unhappy about the world, usually because other people were making them unhappy. JJ himself is one of the founding members of the Gamers Against Weed and is blessed with unnatural luck. Nothing bad ever really happens to him, but it does happen to the other people around him. He wanted to give a way to give that power to others, so they made Mr. Destiny. But bad things still happen to Mr. Destiny all the time, like he's some kind of magnet for it. But every time he's able to overcome it, and when people are around him, they're able to overcome their problems as well. And also, they accidentally made him exist all across time to whenever people were thinking about their purpose, because Fallout Meta TXT was just a little too good. Which is how he ended up walking into a summoning circle of salt in the middle of Head Cop OGG's dorm room with a dog head and no shirt on. She ended up getting the other members on a Discord call and yelling at them, though all they had to say was sorry. Since Destiny is old, he's racked up a lot of enemies. the Gamers Against Weed worked together to create the hidden island where he could help people without any threats. Except the GOC, but they're inept, and that did get them Green Man Walking, who now serves as Seneschal and Steward of Kenowhere. Bones also interviews Mr. Destiny over the chat. Bones begins the interview by telling Mr. Destiny that it has been requested that he change his name from the Throne of the Third Heaven of the nation's Millennium General Assembly. Destiny says its advice is well noted, and continues on without changing it. He says that he's as old as the word fate. Bones asks if he could translate that into years of the Gregorian calendar, to which he replies, no. The crux of the interview is Bones trying to determine whether or not the throne of the third heaven of the nation's Millennium General Assembly's enemies will put the Gamers Against Weed in danger. It may be an extraterrestrial planet-killer satellite, but Bones cares about the friends it made in the chat rooms. Destiny, I'm not going to keep using his chat name because it's way too long, says that it would be easier if that were true, but the reality is that the Gamers Against Weed have created their own enemies by banding together in a group. If only a handful of them had gotten together amongst themselves, they would have been fine. They would have been able to deal with any problems that came their way. But by escaping the threat of loneliness and banding together as a larger group, they attract the attention of the bigger players of the supernatural world. Because he lauds their efforts, he wants to give them the foresight and the will to act, so that they can protect himself from the threats they incite, such as the Foundation and the GOC. After the interview, this section ends with Bones informing us, the reader, that everything in this document is classified. No one outside of the founding members of the GAW, or Green Man Walking, is allowed to mention knowledge of Kenowhere without their permission. Everything in the document is dangerous information, but, Bones tells us, as a contributing member of the Gamers Against Weed, it is our right to know. Moving on to yet another tab, this one is a list of all the ways that people can help Kenowhere, providing it with the things it needs. Highlights include reference manuals, comic books, sheet glass for greenhouses, saplings of fruit trees, pigs, diesel, copper, wind turbine blades, antibiotics, soap, clothes, tarps, scalpels, medical tubing, everything on the list of the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. Green Man Walking even suggests stealing gloves from the doctor's office or grabbing books from an Amazon truck. If people can anomalously transfer power from one place to another, that would also be swell. We then get Polar Ice Crafts explaining how the barrier works. It's not a very clear explanation, but it's not a very stable anomaly either, and he needs more people to help him make it work. The anomaly isn't really a single anomaly. First, there's the protective barrier that keeps any unwanted people out. Then, there's a sort of Faraday cage that keeps all of the light and life energy and information about what actually is on the island hidden. Both parts of the anomaly take a lot of effort and energy to maintain, and PIC asks for volunteers who can work magic to help, but Kenowhere needs a good 8 more people to work constantly in shifts to maintain the bubble and the illusion, which is no small order. Gay Cop MP4 and Lesbian Gengar then repeat the importance of security, stressing that no one can mention Kenowhere or knowledge of it to anyone outside of the GAW. Lesbian Gengar also asks that if anyone can give the camp mimetic properties, or as she puts it, perform any perceptual woo, to make people less likely to think about it, to get in touch with her. Last in this bit has Head Cop OGG and Green Man Walking talk about actually getting to the island, including explaining that Mr. Destiny is not going to be handing out superpowers or anything like that. Blunt Fiend is the most magic one in the group, but when he met Mr. Destiny, they spent 5 minutes together, and then Blunt Fiend spent an hour weeping about it. He's still just as magic as he was before, but won't talk about the experience other than to say that he doesn't recommend it. They give 4 valid reasons for wanting to go to the island. 1. You believe that your abilities can help. People in this group are asked to provide 2 or 3 pages explaining how they can help and that they're mentally prepared to live on an island in the middle of nowhere. 2. You have nowhere else to go. Kenowhere is a place for the lost and broken and the abandoned. They still want to interview this group, but they understand that it's hard to talk about and they don't want to keep people in unsafe situations. But, well, OPSEC is important. And 3, you want to be better. They still don't really want to pry much at people who have personal reasons, but also still want to maintain security. They'll be screening applicants and using a lie detector as well as truth-seeing powder on anyone they feel is suspicious. Head cop OGG begs people not to lie about their intentions because the truth-seeing powder has nasty side effects and she's not used to such strong magic. And last, 4, people who feel the pull of Mr. Destiny, in which case, frankly, they don't need permission to get to the island, they'll be able to get there on their own. If you feel the call, capital C, of Mr. Destiny, you get a little bit of JJ's luck. People who have felt the call can't be kept from heading to Kenowhere. They've come into possession of plane or bus tickets, they've gotten visas surprisingly fast, they've had friends who conveniently started moving and wanted some company on the way. They found classified documents that were unexpectedly easy to steal, and, finding they are able to get over the shock of a man with a dog's head showing up in their dorm room surprisingly quickly when their roommate, who is under a cognito manipulative effect not to notice anything weird that happens in your dorm room, comes in, talks to him like he doesn't have a dog's head and does have a shirt on, and finds him so charming that she offers him some of her leftover dessert, and they don't even mind not getting offered the leftover dessert because it was kind of cute. That last one being what happened to head cop OGG, of course. Even on the trip there, people called by Mr. Destiny will have luck, like getting a good seat on the bus, or having unusually good conversations to keep them entertained, or finding a rare translation of Ovid you couldn't find anywhere else until you were boyfriends for a long time in college and you've always been there for each other ever since, gave you a copy for your birthday that you still treasure even though you can read Ovid in Latin now, right by where you remember last reading your briefing material on KTE 6561 Black in your quarters, even though you were afraid you lost it. That one happened to Green Man Walking, clearly. You'll also get to hug a dog that can hug you back. Getting to the island itself is also blessed, with people having found rowboats and rowed right in, or performing a magic ritual despite not showing any previous magic powers, and teleporting right into the camp, or having a barge appear, rowed by an oddly comforting hooded specter who felt more like a protector than death, and got them there in about as much time as it took to process everything, or simply walking out into the water and finding that debris conveniently made a bridge in front of them and flowed away behind them, or just walking, literally, on the water. After that, the luck wears off, but Mr. Destiny is nice, he's never bitten anyone who wasn't evil, and he's wanted to see you for a long time. The final section is a note from Blunt Fiend, the GAW leader. The Gamers Against Weed made Destiny. They didn't mean to make him the way they did, but he's one of them and he's family, even if only 5 of the group was involved. He's one of the few Misters Against Weed that actually likes the Gamers Against Weed, and he came to them for help. It is what he is, Bluntfiend says. It does what it does because they made it that way, and if we don't look out for each other, who's going to look out for any of us, right? He then asks Bones, tell him I said that. The SCP universe is filled with organizations and factions, some good, some evil, and some, like the Foundation, are morally gray. So it's nice to see a group that has the good of the world in mind. As I said before, the Gamers Against Weed are a group of interest that is often misunderstood. Despite their silly name and their anomalous shitposts, they're one of the most wholesome and heartfelt organizations. They care more than anyone else, and in many ways, they represent the soul of the SCP community. Equal parts silly and serious, and way queerer and further left than a lot of people would expect. Or even appreciate. Welcome to the end of the video. Sorry for how often my voice seems to be a scratchy, nasally mess. The Gamers Against Weed are really my jam, and this skip in particular really resonated with me. I don't plan on doing solely SCP content or anything, but I do think that I'll try doing this again, especially in regards to other Gamers Against Weed stories. If you've made it this far, I'd just like to say thank you. And if you enjoyed it, I'd really appreciate it if you liked and shared it, though I'll admit I'm no exploring series. I'd need a ton more images if I want to be like him. I'd also like to thank the people who support me, both as patrons and in general, whose names are here on the screen. If you'd like to support me as well, you can find the links below. I've had a few folks get mad about that before, so I'll just link to my site. But I will admit, yeah, there's a plague on right now, so I'd really appreciate it if you threw a bit of cash my way to tell me that you enjoyed this.